Welcome back to the Gen 20 podcast. I'm Nicole, and today I'll be interviewing Marina, who wrote a novel, which is the title of this episode. Marina wrote a novel, and that's just such an incredible accomplishment. Let's just take a moment and all clap our hands for Marina.
Thank you.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about Marina's process and where she plans to go from here. So the first thing that I want to know, Marina, is what made you want to write fiction?
That's a good question. So I wasn't sure I was going to write fiction. When I went to grad school, I had the intention of, I went to grad school for my MFA in writing. And I went with the intention of kind of doing more nonfiction because I thought that was really interesting. And then as I got into the classes, I realized my fiction was really weak. And I'm someone who likes to be good at everything and be really smart. And so I was like, all right, I have to work on my fiction, and fell in love with it because you can kind of just make stuff up. Like that's kind of what fiction writing is. And there's obviously like more art and craft to it, but I'd be writing a scene, and rather than thinking like, okay, what would have happened next? I'd write, like, well, what if this dog ran through, and I just like add things and see what would happen. So I just really enjoyed the process of it and the creativity and kind of freedom it afforded me. And I realized how many ideas I had bouncing around in my head that I wanted to try to bring to life on paper.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, honestly. So tell me a little bit more about your career path up until this point in time. And yeah, like, have you always wanted to be a writer? Has writing always been,
You can't see Nicole, but she's doing some hand motions right now. Yeah. So funny enough, I wrote my first like mini novel when I was in the third grade, and it was about little chicks because I think we were doing a science unit where we hatched chicks. And then I wrote, I guess, on and off for English classes and things like that. And I always really loved it. But in my mind, I was a very practical kid and was like, I need to have a stable future and a stable career. And that means I can't be a writer. And so I decided I was going to be an editor because if I was an editor, I'd still be around books. And so I went to school. I don't know what I was doing, but I got my degree in French and creative writing because I just loved the language and communication and everything about studying French. And with that, I intended to go into publishing. And I had interned at a publishing house in college. And then after college, spent months and years trying to get my foot in the door at a publishing house back in New York City. And I worked for, oh my God, I'm blanking. I worked for Warby Parker in their customer experience department for almost 2 years while I lived in New York and tried to figure myself out. And in the time I did that, I also stumbled across Gen 20. So I was writing just for fun because it made me happy, but then had the like quote unquote big adult job that I should have had that had, 401k and health insurance and stability.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so miserable. So I finally got to a point where I think I was looking for jobs for a year. So like 6 months into my time at my job in New York, I started looking for new jobs and looked for another year until I realized I needed more structure. I needed more help developing the skills that would help me in the field I wanted to be in. So I went to grad school for writing because that's ultimately what I wanted to do. But funny enough, I still didn't let myself believe I could be a writer. I just figured, oh, I'll hone my writing skills and then I'll go work for a creative agency or in marketing, or I ended up working in LA for Disney doing some editing I was an editorial assistant for their comics and magazines department, which was really interesting. I learned a ton, but again, at the end was really unhappy because I realized I'm just not happy in a 9 to 5 with so much structure that I feel like I'm suffocated. And so when the pandemic started, I actually lost my job because of cutbacks. And that's when I first started thinking, I'm going to work on this novel because I've got the time and the job search doesn't look great right now. So I'm just going to focus on this. And I've spent the last year writing. And in that process, I realized how, I mean, all things considered, it was a garbage year, but how happy I was to be writing, even though I wasn't being paid for it. I could see myself making a career out of it. So that's a long way to say that I always wanted to be a writer, but didn't believe it was in the cards for me. So I didn't let myself pursue it truly until 2 years after I got my MFA in writing.
Mhm.
And and now I'm not turning back. I've started my own business with writing coaching. I host writing sprints to encourage other new writers to work on their craft. And I finished my first manuscript. I have two other partial manuscripts. I have a bunch of short stories. So I'm kind of just taking the time to work on those and hopefully be able to publish them and get some traction from there.
Yeah, I think that looking back on your career path, it all kind of makes sense that you ended up where you are now.
Mm-hmm.
So, because of how last year turned out with the pandemic and everything, what made you decide, okay, this is like, I'm just sitting down now and working on this novel? And so, how did you end up setting your goal and your deadline?
It's funny. So when I had moved back to my mom's house, I was quarantining here because we all thought it would be like a 2-week quarantine. And I was like, oh, it'll be a little vacation. And then I lost my job and realized I didn't want to pay rent on an apartment. So my mom was very gracious to let me move home. And that kind of gave me some security to explore what I wanted to be doing for a job. And I was talking to my friend and career coach, Serena, who kind of was just like, well, you always talk about writing. Why don't you just work on your novel? And I was like, oh, yeah, I have some ideas. And so I actually started a manuscript that I began the year before for NaNoWriMo, which is, if you don't know, it's this like organization called the NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month of November. You basically try to write a novel during the month of November, and it's a nonprofit, and it's a really cool program, and it's free. You can just say you're doing it. And I had tried it while I was working full time and just couldn't work full time and write at the same time. So I picked that story back up and wrote from April till about August and was struggling so hard. I set my word count goal of 60,000 words because that is about the industry standard for a like contemporary fiction novel. It's about 200 pages. And so I do really well with specific goals
Mhm.
and deadlines and like measurements to hit. So I made a chart on a piece of graph paper and like would write every day. And I did the math of like, okay, if I wrote Monday through Friday every day, and my original goal was August 1st, how many words would I need to hit a day? And then I hope that this makes sense. I'm kind of all over the place, but I would write every day. And last year was very tumultuous. So there'd be days that I couldn't get creative juice flowing or just would write and delete everything. And then by the end of the summer, I didn't hit my goal and realized I really hated the story I was working on. And so I um, thought about why was I feeling so blocked, and then went back into some of the work I did in grad school and picked up a couple of chapters I had written for a class that I never had any intention of continuing with. It was just an assignment. And I loved the characters from that assignment. So I just picked those chapters back up and started writing to it. And it just came out where like I wrote between the middle of October and the end of December, I wrote uh, 44,000 words, which to me was a lot, and especially at the end. But I think I just, I needed a deadline. And so I made my new deadline the end of the year because there was something symbolic about just finishing it in 2020. And then
Mhm.
I really worked hard every day trying to get words in. And I learned a lot about myself and fell back in love with writing in the process, which I didn't know was possible because I was like, I love writing, but I actually really love writing.
Mhm. So, what was the hardest part of completing this journey?
I think the self-doubt I felt, especially at the beginning when I wasn't really liking the story I was working on, and my goal felt so hard and impossible and far away that it'd be really hard to motivate myself, or I would get writing and have all of these like gremlins in my head thinking, this isn't a good story, no one's going to care, it's garbage, like all these terrible things about just like how it's not a good story or not good writing, or that nothing will come of it. It was really hard to overcome those obstacles. I even have a note card that says, "It's okay, it's just a draft, keep typing," on my bulletin board to remind myself, like, don't get in your own way. Just keep going. It's worth it. So that was probably the difficult part, was just overcoming me being in my own way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's definitely like a common issue where, especially, I don't know if it's just a writer issue or just generally, but I think people do get in their own way a lot because it's like you kind of forget to look at it like objectively because you're so close to it, you know?
Yeah. And it felt, especially for a while, it was the only thing I was working on. So it felt really important and really big. And then I kind of took a step back and realized this novel that I was working on did not define me. And if I finished it, it didn't mean I was like a good person or a valuable person or whatever. It was just something I
Mm-hmm.
was working on. And writing can be a pretty solitary activity. It can feel really lonely. And when you feel stuck, it's even harder, because if someone in your life isn't a writer, they'll try to encourage you, but they'll say, "Oh, just sit down and write," which
Mm-hmm.
doesn't feel like that. It's not helpful.
Yeah.
So I started a writing community. There's like 20 people in it, but I love all of the people in it. And we talk, every week about our struggles and setbacks. And I host this writing sprint where we just get on Zoom and write together so that you don't feel so alone, because it can be like you get there and you're writing and you get in your head and like, it's like, what's the point? What am I doing?
Mm-hmm.
But you kind of have to just quiet that voice.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think it was such a good idea to start the writing sprints that you did. So
Thanks.
now that you have completed your novel, you've written the draft, what is the next step in the process? Like, where are you going from here with this?
So I'm kind of excited because it's just all going to be a big learning experience. But I found a woman who is a developmental editor and she's reading my draft. And so what that means is that she'll look over my manuscript for pacing, for character development and character arc, for plot points, to make sure everything makes sense, to make sure it's a tightly written or tightly knit story. And she'll give me feedback for where it can be improved. And then from there, I'll start revising. And once I feel like it's in a good place revision wise, I will send it to some friends as beta readers. Nicole will be one of them. I forgot to ask her, you want to be a beta reader?
I'm available, yes.
Just to get feedback from my peers who I value their opinion. And then eventually I will hire an editor to like make sure my language is tight and there are no typos and spellings and stuff like that. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
kind of at a bridge where I want to publish. Obviously, that's my goal was to write a novel, and then my secondary goal was to publish it. And so now in 2021, we kind of are in a unique position where publishing has really evolved and the industry is involved. So there's traditional publishing where someone like a publishing house, like the big five, Penguin, Random House, it's Penguin, Random House, Hachette, etc. They will buy your manuscript and publish it. And there's some smaller publishers and more independent publishing companies that also do that. Or you can self-publish through Amazon and through other companies. And I really don't know what's better for my manuscript at this point, and I don't know the exact path for either of those. So I'm in a couple Facebook groups to kind of learn more about the process. Like, if you want to go the traditional route, you have to find an agent to represent your novel. And so there's like a querying process where you try to find an agent. And so I'm in the learning stages of that right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I look forward to seeing where that journey takes you. I'm very interested.
Thank you. I'm excited. I feel really hopeful and good. I feel really good about the story I wrote, um, even though I know it needs a lot of revision because there were times while I was writing that I literally said, "It doesn't matter. I'll fix it later," which
Hmm.
is true.
Yeah, I think it's always easier to edit a draft than to write the first draft.
Exactly. Yeah. It was getting started is always the hardest part of any project, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. So, since writing has always been such a big part of your life and it always will be, like, tell us, what do you love most about writing?
Oh, man. Um, I don't know that I can like cohesively or coherently explain what it does, but I when I write, I feel like I'm home. Like I feel most myself. I feel comfortable in my brain, in my skin, in my presence, and I like that I can be creative and try to communicate an idea that might translate well to someone else.
Hmm.
I was a pretty shy kid and felt really insecure and really lonely for a long time. And I remember reading The Truth About Forever by Sarah Dessen, which we talked about in another podcast about books that change our lives. But that book was the first time I ever saw myself in a character or saw myself in someone else. And so for so long, words have been this like bridge to humanity when I feel like I'm stuck on the other side, which is I think
Hmm.
why I ended up studying French because it brought me such joy to learn to communicate with another culture, with another group of people. And so writing is just another way for me to connect with people and connect with emotions that can feel really solitary but are actually universal.
Yeah, I love that. I think a lot of writers feel similarly, would you say?
Hmm. Yeah, I think so. Most of my friends I've talked to who are writers would agree that it's just kind of a way of navigating through the world.
Yeah, I like that. Navigating through the world through writing. Yeah. So, as a writer, what do you find the biggest struggle to be? Not necessarily just writing a novel, but like with writing in general.
I think a lot of people get hung up on this idea of what or who a writer is. And so I always say that if you want to be a writer, just write. You don't have to write for anyone. You don't have to publish. You don't have to have a blog. If you sit down and write in a journal every night, you're a writer. And I think
Hmm.
like letting yourself define what it means for you is a really important step. And then writing consistently is the other thing. One of the people in my accountability writing sprint group was asking, what advice do you have for writers? And I was like, honestly, just write every day. And it's really annoying because I got that advice in grad school and was like, I don't have time to write every day. But you do. If you want, it's like anything that's important to you, you have 10 minutes to do it in your day.
Hmm.
And so I think that's a really important thing that people kind of get stuck about is like you don't have to be a good writer, you don't have to be the most eloquent or have the biggest vocabulary. You just sit down and write what you're feeling or thinking. And also, if you want to be a writer, you need to be reading. Just a pro tip out there, read more and you'll write better.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is also a very important thing that people tend to overlook as writers is like the amount of reading and like reading all different types of genres.
That's a huge thing. I read very similar genres for a long time, and then through my courses in grad school was kind of forced to step outside of my comfort zone, and it changed my writing style and my voice and my understanding of what good writing was or meant to me. And I I didn't read a ton while I was writing because I just only have so many hours in a day. But when I would get stuck with, if I was having trouble with dialogue or scenes or something, I would purposefully stop what I was working on and go pick a book that I really loved and read sections of it for inspiration and guidance. And I don't think I've been a reader. Before I was a writer, I was a reader. And I've been a
Hmm.
big reader my whole life. And I don't think I would have be where I am now as a writer if I hadn't read so much. It's also why I'm trying to read 100 books this year. I've read 3, wish me luck. I'm
You
overwhelmed.
can do it. You can do it. You're on track.
Yeah, I'm going to come to Nicole's house and read a bunch of children's books to her son and
Yeah,
count
that's
that.
fine. I'm
Perfect.
sure he'll love it.
I'm great at doing voices.
Yeah. That's like the biggest part of children's books for sure.
It's the best part.
All right. So to round out this Marina wrote a novel
I wrote a novel.
interview, what advice you have for people who are working on writing a novel right now or who have set a goal for themselves to write a novel? Like, what would you tell them to help them on this journey to complete their goal, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say the important things to be doing are writing consistently. So it doesn't have to be a big word count a day, but try to write for half an hour every day minimum. And it doesn't have to be big, bold things, but just try to write every day so that your memory and muscles are warmed up. And find a community where you feel supported, even if it's just one or two friends that you can talk about. I have my two closest friends from grad school. We have a group chat, and I would text them probably every other day of like where I was in my novel and how it felt. I texted Nicole so much, especially towards the end. Like I was like, I have this many words left. And she was a great supporter. But I think because writing is so solitary and it's kind of like you can only you can do it. So having people you can count on to lean on in times of writer's block or triumph is really important to keep up your momentum.
Mm-hmm.
And make sure your goals are achievable. If you're thinking, I want to write a 6,000 page book in a month, that might not be realistic. But and don't do it just because you think that's what it means to be a writer or because that is how you are successful. Just like pick a goal that means something to you.
Mm-hmm.
Like even if this book never gets published, I wrote it in a really hard year and that means a lot to me. And that was my goal, was just to finish a novel.
Mm-hmm. And you reached your goal, and that is so exciting, and major congratulations to you
Thank you.
for
Thank you.
doing that. It's a huge accomplishment. You should be very proud. So thank you so much for taking the time to tell us all about your journey as a writer and you're setting this goal and reaching it. So where can we find you on the internet for your writing journey?
Yeah, so I'm most active on Instagram. And by most active, I mean I lurk, but I don't post a ton. So Marina Kraus writes, and my last name is spelled Crouse. So you can find me on Instagram at Marina Kraus Writes. You can find me on my website, marinakrauswrites.com. I have a Facebook page that I'm also not that active on. And then you can also email me if you want to reach out, marinakrauswrites@gmail.com.
All right, and thank you so much again, Marina, for sharing
Thank
this with
you.
us.
Thanks so much for having me and for being along for the ride. I so appreciate it.
So this has been another episode of the Gen 20 podcast. We'd love if you leave a rating or a review. We'd love to hear from you on what you thought. And if you want to connect with Marina, all of her information will be in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll chat again soon. Bye.
Bye.